With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right. Even if the whole world is telling you to move. It is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say no. You move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Good evening, everybody, and you may notice that we're actually in a different studio tonight. This is just sort of a test run. Honestly, I'm not sure how this is going to go, but we wanted to at least do a test run for the new studio, so we're going to do an episode here. May not be able to do one tomorrow. We're going to take a look, see what works, what doesn't, that sort of thing. But we're going to do the best that we can to continue to bring you great programming. Sorry we've kind of been at a hiatus. We have been building the new studio, and hopefully we're able to get everything up and running and get things the way that we want to before too long. But thank you so much for being with us, whether you're joining us on YouTube, Twitch, Twitter, Facebook, or Periscope. However you're choosing to join us, we definitely appreciate you coming to the channel, subscribing, making sure that you're paying attention to what's going on in the local and state news especially. Which, by the way, there is quite a lot of buzz going on right now because, of course, this weekend was a huge news week for us on both the national and international stage. But since we've left you, since we've not been having any episodes, boy, there has been a firestorm of news to come out in our Senate race. And there's actually a lot of other issues in Alabama. We probably won't be able to get to all of those today, but right now we're going to specifically focus on the Senate race because for those of you who have not heard, we have breaking news that came just a couple of hours ago that our own Secretary of State, one John Merrill, has announced that tomorrow he is going to announce what he's going to do as far as the race comes. So I actually apply the same rule, even though they're very, very different people. I apply the same rule, the same rationale and logic to John Merrill that I did to Roy Moore when we found out that Roy Moore announced that he's going to be announcing something, which is, I don't know, like announcementception or something. I do think it's weird that they make announcements that they're going to announce things, although I will say it makes more sense than when they tell you what the announcement is ahead of time. I can't tell you the number of Democrat candidates that have been entering the race, and Republicans do it too. It just happens that right now Donald Trump is an incumbent, and so there's no Republicans really running for office. That they'll tell you, I'm going to announce my candidacy for president in a couple days. Well, then there's no need for you to announce it. You just told us that you're going to announce it. At least in this case, they're saying that they're going to announce what I'm going to do as opposed to saying I'm going to announce that I'm running. So John Merrill didn't do that. He didn't give us confirmation that he was running. However, I apply the same rationale and logic here that I did when Roy Moore told us that he was going to announce what his decision was about the United States Senate seat for the state of Alabama. And that is, one of two things is going to happen, because you don't have a big formal announcement like this for no reason. And you don't have a big formal announcement like this to announce that you're not going to run. It simply does not happen. Now, maybe John Merrill throws a monkey wrench into the whole thing and announces, nope, not running. That's all I wanted to say. But you don't make a big media buzz about it. Mo Brooks is a perfect example. Mo Brooks, because he ran for it last time, people were suspicious and thinking that he might get into it, and were hoping that he would get into it. I was one of those people. And what Mo Brooks did was, in an interview, casually, didn't tell the media that I'm going to announce what I'm going to do soon. What he did was, he did in a radio interview, he said, no, not going to run. Very informal, not a lot of pomp and circumstance. He didn't make a dog and pony show out of it. And so because of that, I'm guessing, could be wrong, but I'm guessing that what is happening now is that John Merrill is going to do one of two things. He is either going to announce that he's running, which right now seems the most likely, It's very rare that somebody makes a big formal announcement like this without actually announcing that they're running. So it's possible that it's something else, but the odds are very much in the favor of John Merrill tomorrow announcing to the state that he is going to be running for the state seat. Now, the other option is he announces that he is not running, but he doesn't just announce that he's not running, he announces something else. And if that is the case, my guess would be he's announcing that he's not running and he is going to throw his full support behind another candidate. Because again, you don't have a big dog and pony show just to announce, hey, by the way, I'm not running. Which means that right now it's very likely that what is actually going to happen is that he does make a big announcement and he does want to draw a bunch of media attention and he does want to draw a lot of cameras and radio microphones and everything else to tell people, I'm not running, but I am throwing my weight, I'm throwing my political clout behind this guy, and I want you, everybody that would like to vote for me, I want them to instead vote for this candidate. So if he announces that he's not going to run, that's really the only reason that I can think of to have all of the media coverage and to tease and to build political tension if he's not going to announce the run himself. Because if you're not running and you're not endorsing a candidate, you don't care. Now, again, you can do this without having a big media to do. In fact, that's exactly what we saw from the Mo Brooks campaign. You may recall that he also said, I'm not running, and by the way, I endorse this candidate, but did so very informally. And to be honest, I imagine, unless John Merrill is super in for one particular candidate, which I don't really see, to my knowledge, Secretary of State John Merrill doesn't have that close-knit relationship with any of these candidates, at least that I'm aware of. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe it's something that, because I don't know everything about the interpersonal relationships of our constitutional officers in the state of Alabama. I mean, maybe he's really good buddies with Bradley Byrne, or maybe he's been secretly working behind the scenes with the Tuberville campaign. I kind of doubt that, but I mean, I guess it's a possibility. But right now, all the signs, all the smart political money is John Merrill's going to run. And so that's where the smart money is right now. That's where my money would be right now. If I were betting just based on what I've seen politically, there's a very good chance that tomorrow we will have our Secretary of State, John Merrill, in the race for the Alabama Senate seat. I do not see another reason why all this pomp and circumstance shows up if that's not the reason. So if that happens, how do you feel about that? That's really what I want to ask, because I know that John Merrill is a very popular figure. But one thing that is surprising to me is that John Merrill, the last time I talked to him, I think I even asked him about this. No, what I did was I asked him about the governorship. I asked him, Secretary Merrill, why is it that you didn't opt in for running for governor? And he said, you know what? I just want to be Secretary of State. And based on his reaction, he seemed very genuine in that. But the man knows that he's not going to be able to run for Secretary of State in the next go round. And so maybe what's happening now is he's saying, I really like being Secretary of State. I really want to be Secretary of State. That's always the job that I've wanted. But a time is going to come very soon that I will not be able to fulfill that role. And because of that, it may make sense to go ahead and prepare for the future and go ahead to have a job lined up ahead of time. And if, for whatever reason, I don't wind up getting that seat, well, then, I do something else. So that may be what's going on here, that he wants to do this job because he'll more or less be able to finish out his term. I mean, the campaign might be a distraction, but he'll more or less be able to finish out his term as Secretary of State for the most part, and then go ahead and be the senator for the last little bit of what would have been his last term as a Secretary of State. So that may be what's going on. If I had to guess, that's his rationale behind it, just based on what I know about the man. But we'll see. And maybe this is a big dog and pony show because he's backing somebody else and he really wants to draw as much media as possible to help them out, but I doubt it. I don't see that happening. But there is another candidate that everybody suspected might get in the race, and we found out this past Thursday, actually, he is going to be in the race, and that is, of course, Roy Moore. Roy Moore has more lives than Super Mario. I mean, the guy just, it does not matter what happens to him politically. He always seems to pop up in another election, and somehow he's always viable regardless of what happened to him in the previous election or in his previous term in elected office. So, really, that's just who Judge Moore is. The guy is politically immortal, and I don't really understand how, but he is. And he announced on Thursday, just as I predicted, that he was going to run. For those of you, of course, I didn't have a show because I've been, trying to get the studio up and running. But for those of you who have been following me on social media, you probably remember that I actually predicted exactly this scenario. I predicted that what was going to happen is that that Judge Moore was going to announce his candidacy, that you don't make a big to-do about this unless you're going to announce that you are in fact running. And my prediction turned out to be true. I imagine my prediction will turn out to be true about John Merrill. That's not a testament to how, I'm not reading the tea leaves or anything. This is common sense when it comes to politics. This is not because I'm such a super genius and can see the future. It really is just, as a general rule, you don't make these announcements unless you're actually going to announce your candidacy. So that's what I'm guessing is going to happen. And since this happened, since Judge Moore announced he is going to be running, and I am so incredibly frustrated with this whole ordeal, this whole situation, that Roy Moore, I mean, the reason that we have Doug Jones in office right now is going to try to run again in the same race, presumably if he wins the primary, against the same guy. I don't like political do-overs much. I don't. And I think the American people, as a general rule, really don't either. I think part of the reason, not the entire reason, but part of the reason that people did not want Hillary Clinton and did not want Jeb Bush is because it felt like a political do-over. Now, Republicans were a little more staunch in that, and the RNC's rules were a little bit more freed up as opposed to the Democrats, who have the super delegates, which, give extra votes to the candidate basically of the DNC's choosing. But the American people had absolutely no appetite for another Clinton-Bush election. We just didn't. And as a general rule, I think that holds true within the state of Alabama as well. We already had the Jones-Moore campaign. We don't want another one. And because of that, I think that Roy Moore is going to have an even harder time winning the primary than he did last time. And remember, he didn't exactly win it walking away the last time. He was involved in a runoff and then finally beat Luther Strange to be the Republican candidate. So Judge Moore already had a struggle to get to the GOP primary slot to be able to be the Republican nominee, and eventually did win that, and then went on to very narrowly lose to Doug Jones. But I think that if Judge Moore does wind up, I think that becomes a bigger hurdle for him in the primaries, just because I don't think people want a repeat of the former election. And generally speaking, not always, but generally speaking, up until really about a few months ago within the Democrat Party, the general political wisdom was people don't like political losers. It's not that you can't have ever lost a contest politically in your life and still be a candidate. It's not like that. But generally speaking, there's a lot less appetite for you if you lost, especially a high-profile race. You can look at Democrats have kind of gone the other direction on this, because there is, for some reason, a large political appetite for people like Stacey Abrams and Bob Francis O'Rourke and some other people that have lost some state elections. Andrew Gillum in Florida is another example of this. But as a general rule, and most of the time in the past, people really just did not want to see a repeat election. And so because of that, I think that the voters are less likely to select Moore as their candidate in the primary. Now, maybe I'm wrong on that, and granted, he is leading in the polls. Why he's leading in the polls, I don't know, but he is leading in the polls. I think a lot of that has to do with name recognition more than anything else. But look, they are what they are. Right now, Roy Moore is the person that is polling the best in the primaries. And we'll see if that actually winds up playing out. So they did an interview with Jeff Poore on WVNN, which is our sister station at News Radio 1440. We're, of course, part of the Cumulus family, WVNN. They're our sister station in Huntsville. And on the Jeff Poore show, Roy Moore did an interview and sort of gave an explanation as to why he's running again and his thoughts on the primaries. And it was actually a pretty good little interview, and it gave us a lot of insight, I think, into Judge Moore and where he sees himself and where everything is going. So we're going to go ahead and dive into that. One of the things that he said, I think the people of Alabama aren't being represented properly now. And I think the last election, because of Project Birmingham and other factors, the vote was stolen from the people. All right, so we're going to break this down really quickly. First of all, I think that the vast majority of Alabamians would agree that Doug Jones is a terrible representative for the state of Alabama. As far as the general beliefs, the general sentiments, the desires of the people of Alabama go, Doug Jones does not reflect that. Not even close. And we've talked about this over and over again. We are the state that literally just passed a ban, a full-on ban on abortion, with a large consensus of the state's population backing it. I mean, yes, it was the House and the Senate and then eventually the governor that made it into law, but they would not have done that, and it would have been a much bigger uphill battle had it not been for a large plurality, a large majority of the Alabama people supporting that law. So the fact that Abortion Jones is our representative, considering we're the state that did that, yeah, that is a pretty big red flag that the people of Alabama are not being accurately represented. Their values are not being represented on the national stage because Doug Jones is the one charged with being one of our senators. So Roy Moore is 100% spot on that. But the thing is, and this is what's so important in a primary, he has to distinguish himself from the rest of the field. There is not a single other Republican candidate in this field that would disagree with that. It's the same thing when you're watching the presidential debates, and we're going to see this quite a bit in the Democrat debates. What are the Democrats all going to do? They are all going to talk about how much they dislike Trump. But the thing is, that does nothing to distinguish them from the other Democrats that are beside them. Because every Democrat on that stage is going to talk about how much they hate Orange Man. That's going to be a large portion of the debate. But if you're a Democrat voter and you're taking this seriously and you're trying to parse through which of these candidates do I want to throw my vote behind, then that doesn't do anything to help you answer that question because they all dislike Trump. Now, they might try to outdo each other and tell you, well, I just like Trump more. No, I just like Trump more. But see, we're seeing the same thing play out on this smaller stage here in the state of Alabama. These candidates are going to talk about how bad a senator Doug Jones is, and he is. I don't disagree with that. But the problem with it is if they spend too much time on that, they're wasting their time because Judge Moore saying that Senator Jones is a bad representative of Alabama is an accurate statement, but every single one of his primary opponents also believes that, so that's not really a reason for me to vote for you. All right, and the second part of this, he says because of Project Birmingham and other factors, the vote was stolen from the people. So what he's referring to is Project Birmingham. The Washington Post unearthed this. It was essentially a misinformation campaign that was launched against Judge Moore. There were two of them that we know about. First was Project Birmingham, and essentially what Project Birmingham did was it was a campaign to make it look as though Judge Moore was the product of Russia. So it was people posing as Russians, people that were pretending to be friends of and allies of, and people taking directives of the Kremlin that were in favor of Roy Moore winning this election, that wanted Roy Moore to be the candidate that goes on, and basically trying to set him up as some kind of puppet candidate that would be in the pocket of Vladimir Putin. And then you had a secondary misinformation campaign against him that was stating that Judge Moore was essentially for proration. So Judge Moore supported getting rid of alcohol altogether. Alcohol should be banned, and we should revise the constitutional amendment against the consumption of alcohol and bring proration back. That was essentially the case that was being made. Here's the problem, though. Were these campaigns, these misinformation campaigns, were they dishonest? Yes. Were they wrong? Absolutely. If you're going to criticize a political candidate on the merits of what he's saying and what he believes, that's fine. Don't lie about his position. Don't set up a false position that the man has and then fight against that and say, see how crazy this guy is, when those aren't things that he actually believes. And the same thing with the Russian involvement. Don't make it out that he's some sort of Manchurian candidate in the pocket of Russia, some kind of Russian sleeper agent, when that's not the case. But here's the thing. We all remember the Roy Moore, Doug Jones campaign. It's all fresh in our minds, unless you're somebody who just didn't follow politics very much, and I mean basically lived under a rock a couple of years ago. We all remember how that campaign played out. We all remember having various discussions with our loved ones, our neighbors, about who they were going to vote for. And there was a wide range of topics that were discussed in that election. Everything from, oh, I really like Roy Moore, I'm going to vote for him, couldn't be more excited about it, to, and I think this one was more common, I don't know, I guess I'll vote for Roy Moore, I don't like Doug Jones. And then you also had people like, you know what, I'm just out, I don't care anymore, they're both garbage candidates, I don't want to really cast my vote for either of them. And then, of course, we all knew people that voted for Doug Jones as well. And so it was those middle two options. It was options 2 and 3 that I just discussed that really sunk Roy Moore's campaign. It was the people that just kind of stayed home or didn't really want to cast their vote for Roy Moore, that there was virtually no enthusiasm in his camp. And there was a lot of enthusiasm in Doug Jones' camp that had the turnout be just barely enough to cause him to lose the election. Do you remember at any point in any of those discussions, do you ever remember anyone saying, you know, I thought I was going to vote for Roy Moore, but he works for Vladimir Putin? Did you ever hear anybody say about Roy Moore, you know, I like the guy, but I really just like alcohol, and I don't like the fact that he wants to bring back proration? Did these misinformation campaigns happen? Yes, absolutely they did. And they were wrong, and it was bad form, and it's not something that anybody should ever do. But you have to also remember that they were largely unsuccessful. Roy Moore did not lose this election because of Project Birmingham or because of misinformation campaigns against him. It's wrong. It shouldn't have happened. But it's not as though they cheated. It's not as though this tactic was actually effective. And so when it comes to this idea that Roy Moore is trying to put out there that, oh, well, the reason that I lost is because of Project Birmingham. No, that's absurd. I do not know a single person that decided against voting for Roy Moore or just decided to abstain from voting altogether because they thought that Roy Moore was going to try to make alcohol illegal or that he was really working for the Russians. I don't know a single person that believed any of that. So the campaigns existed, sure, but they didn't work. So what's the difference? Maybe there are 3 people out there in the entire state that were swayed by that, but I very much doubt that. And so Roy Moore just trying to come up with excuses on this. And then he also says a little bit later, quote, "This is simply an effort by the Republican establishment in the Senate. What they did in the last campaign, they not only entered the primary and opposed me, but then in the general, they basically joined the Democrats." Judge Moore, do you know who you sound like right now? You sound like Hillary Clinton. And I know that he would take that personally and probably should. But right now, in this interview, the way that you come out swinging, not just in this interview, but in other media appearances that he's done, you sound like Hillary Clinton. Because every time somebody asks Hillary Clinton about the previous campaign, all she can talk about is how it was James Comey's fault. It was the people surrounding me at the when I was the Secretary of State's fault. It was Obama's fault for not endorsing me. It was married women's fault. It was black people's fault. I mean, there are 10,000 different things that Hillary Clinton has blamed for her stunning loss when it comes to getting beat by Donald Trump for the presidency. Roy Moore seems to be eating out of Hillary Clinton's bowl. Not saying that he's liberal, not saying that his policies are anywhere near what Hillary Clinton's are. All I'm saying is you continuously try to rehash and relive this campaign that has already happened, the hay is in the barn. And basically your excuse is, well, it was everybody's fault but mine. The reason that I didn't win because of this, and this. It was this person and this project and this misinformation campaign, and it was the Republican establishment. At the end of the day, it's you. And that's true of Hillary Clinton, and that's true of Roy Moore. If you lost the campaign, it's your fault. Now, I'm not saying that these other things maybe didn't play a role in it, but when it all's said and done, unless somebody stuffed the ballot box, unless there was actual voter fraud going on, which Secretary of State John Merrill looked into, it wasn't the case. And by the way, if John Merrill does enter the race tomorrow and there is a debate, I'm very much looking forward to that conversation in an actual debate setting, where Roy Moore tries to make the claim that the only reason he lost the last election was because of things like Project Birmingham and voter fraud, and John Merrill's looking at him like, no, I was the Secretary of State then. I looked into it. Believe me, it didn't happen. I'm very much looking forward to that happening on stage if these two wind up in a debate with one another. But nonetheless, that's what's going on. And I really hate this you're either with us or against us mentality, because Judge Moore is saying, well, they basically just joined the Democrats. No. The you're with us or against us narrative is just so incredibly childish and stupid. I absolutely despise it. And the thing that bothers me about it is, are you really going to take that stance on everything? So, for example, if Switzerland and Spain and Ireland, they were really working with the Nazis in World War II because they decided to remain neutral? No. Now, you can even make the argument that they had a moral obligation to join the Allied powers and give their support to them to help fight the Nazis. You can even make that argument. But you cannot make the argument that they were really working with the Nazis by not siding with the Allies. No, neutrality is neutrality. And you can even make the argument that neutrality is bad. I don't think that it would be way outside the realm of possibility or it would be outside the realm of basic logic for Roy Moore to be critical of people like Senator Shelby and like the Republican establishment for remaining neutral. That's a legitimate criticism. But you don't say, well, they basically were just working with the Democrats and they really wanted the seat to go to Doug Jones by not supporting me. No, there is a difference in remaining neutral and throwing your support towards the enemy. Those are two entirely different things. And so let's not overblow things and say things that aren't true when it comes to this campaign. Another thing that he said, supposedly they're upset about Doug Jones being up there now, but they helped put him there. I hope in the general election they'll vote properly if they don't want a Democrat there. So what's going on here, because he's talking about the Republican establishment, there is a small kernel of truth in this statement, but not for the reasons that Roy Moore is stating. Because what happened, if you'll remember in the primaries, is that before the runoff happened, it didn't look like Luther Strange was going to be able to secure that number 2 spot. It looked like what was going to happen is it was going to be a runoff between Roy Moore and Mo Brooks. Now, how that would have shaken out if that had happened, I have no idea. It's impossible to go back and do a what-if scenario because we don't know. But I'll tell you this. Mitch McConnell does bear some of the responsibility for Roy Moore being the candidate. And the reason is because he decided he would play kingmaker and show up in the state of Alabama and spend a lot of money that did not originate in the state of Alabama to involve himself in our Senate race. And he did that not by putting out ads for the candidate that he liked, Luther Strange. His plan was to go after go after Mo Brooks, not Roy Moore, so that he could get to the runoff and then hopefully edge out Roy Moore once he got there. And so in the primary, part of what Moore is saying here is true. That Washington insiders like Mitch McConnell and his ilk did try to involve themselves in the state election and tried to edge out Mo Brooks by lying about him in their ads. And I remember because the ads ran on our radio station. Just straight up lying about Mo Brooks and who he was, because Mitch McConnell did not want to deal with an actual conservative. He doesn't want another conservative in the Senate to have to deal with. And he much preferred somebody like Luther Strange, who was much more of a establishment Republican. Did not want to deal with somebody from the Freedom Caucus like Mo Brooks. And so because of that, he decided he would play kingmaker and try to edge out Mo Brooks in order to get Luther Strange in. And he figured once Luther Strange got in, then he'd easily win the election. So yes, there is a sense in which Mitch McConnell is the reason that Doug Jones is in office today, but because he took out the best, most viable candidate in Mo Brooks. The reason that Doug Jones is in office today, there is some truth to this. It's Mitch McConnell, but not because of what Mitch McConnell did in the general, but because of what Mitch McConnell did in the primary when he tried to edge out Mo Brooks. And so, it's kind of true, so we'll give him a little credit there. But what really this boils down to is there is more to elections than the letter behind your name. You should not be able to just have somebody's vote because you happen to have an R behind your name. And that's something that has always irked me. It's always been a point of contention with me. I've always hated it when people act as though, well, people that normally vote Republican or people that normally vote Democrat, they owe me their vote. And if they do anything else, like vote for somebody else or stay home or do a write-in or whatever, then that person is betraying me. You need to vote properly, to use Roy Moore's terminology here. And it always pits it in it's us against them, it's a binary choice. I despise that. But Roy Moore playing that game again, which unfortunately I've come to expect from most politicians. I'm not just laying this at the feet of Roy Moore. This is true of the vast majority of politicians at this point, unfortunately. And then here he goes on, and this is the last thing that we'll look at. This was probably my favorite quote of the day. They're saying I can't win, and yet there's such opposition even before I qualified. If I'm not going to win, why are they opposing me? They're trying to do a double standard. What? This would be like the kid that gets picked last in a game of kickball, saying, "Oh, well, if I was so bad at kickball, then why was everybody afraid to have me on their team?" They're not afraid you'll lose, they're afraid you'll win. They're afraid you're going to win the general they're afraid you're going to win the primary and then lose the general again. See, that's why they do not want you in office. First of all, you're not the best candidate, you're not the best option, you're not the most conservative option. And second, out of all the candidates that we're looking at, out of the entire slate that the GOP has, I gotta say, the only one that I think will probably lose to Doug Jones is Roy Moore. Because we'll just assume that he's going to announce, because I'm predicting that he will. Maybe he won't. John Merrill probably walks away with 70% of the vote. You're looking at Tommy Tuberville. Little bit of a hiccup just because there's so many Alabama fans that might not vote for him because of football, but against Doug Jones, yeah, he winds up winning that election pretty handedly. You got Arnold Mooney. Yeah, Arnold Mooney wins that easily. Now, I don't know how he's going to win the general, but if he gets to the general, if he wins the primary, yeah, he beats Doug Jones no problem. You got Bradley Byrne. Yeah, Bradley Byrne beats Doug Jones. It's not even a contest. The only question mark in this election is Roy Moore. The only one that we're looking at right now that we're like, he might win, he may not win. I'm not saying Roy Moore is absolutely going to lose. I don't know that. But I'm looking at all of the candidates, and every single one, I'm like, oh yeah, he beats Jones easy. He beats Jones easy. Oh, it's no question, he beats Jones. The only one that I'm like, is Roy Moore. And that is not a good place to be. When you're looking at a slate of candidates and you're the only one that might lose the general, you are not the person that needs to be the primary. And if you are somebody, which is kind of what Roy Moore was hearkening to in his last statement here, well, they just need a Republican in there. Any Republican will do. We just need a Republican in there. We need to get a Democrat out of the seat. Okay, well, if that's the case, if that's really the only thing you're concerned about, and I don't think that's the way you should look at it, but if the only thing that you're concerned about is we got to have somebody with an R behind their name in that seat, you're the absolute worst candidate to pick because you're the only one that even has a chance of losing to Doug Jones. And so if that's really your concern, I'm sorry, but Roy Moore is not the guy you go for. But furthermore, and I think that this is really more important than it here, he's completely missing the point. See, he's trying to set himself up as this maverick outsider that is just going up against the establishment. The reason that the establishment doesn't want him is because he'd shake things up and he'd be different. But if that's the case, then you go with somebody like Arnold Mooney, you go with somebody like Tommy Tuberville. Right now, Roy Moore has no compelling reason for you to pick him as the person to put in the general election. He just doesn't. Not one single one. And I don't hate Judge Moore. I don't think he's a horrible human being. I don't believe the stuff that they've said about him being a pedophile or any of that stuff. This is not the reason that I'm putting it in there. I'm just saying that if you're looking at it and you're looking at the slate of candidates right now, I don't know if he's the absolute worst option, but he's definitely in the bottom. I mean, I could see myself voting for just about anybody above Roy Moore, if nothing else, because he's such a huge political liability. And part of the reason for that is that he has no legislative experience at all. Really good judge, knows the Constitution, knows the law pretty well, never been a legislature, and based on my interviews with him, my interactions with him, and the things that I've seen of him talking to other people, he does not seem to have a plan. He does not seem to know what he's going to do once he gets to Washington. It seems like he wants the seat for the sake of having the seat. And that brings me to another point here. It seems as though this has become a vanity project for him. I didn't necessarily think that in the last election. Because, there's always been the allegation that Roy Moore's just a showboat. He's just doing this for the publicity. I never really bought into that until right now. Because I cannot think of another reason that you would enter this race. If you're Roy Moore, I cannot think of another reason you would enter this race unless what it is you think that you got it stolen from you last time, you think that you deserve it this time, and that because of that, you want to sort of wash away the memory, the legacy of losing the previous race by winning this one. And like I said, maybe that happens. I don't know. But if you really cared about this seat being a representation of the people of Alabama, and you know that you're the one that's most likely to lose it, you don't enter the race. I think if he were thinking about the people of Alabama, he would step aside and endorse somebody else. He's not the right man for the job right now. He just isn't. The last time it was the time for him to ride off into the sunset, say, thanks Alabama for the memories. This is not the election that you want to get in if you really care about keeping that seat red. Turning that seat red. You don't enter the race if you're Roy Moore. I think this has become a vanity project for him, and I hate to say that about him, but I think it's the truth. I think this has become an issue of pride for him. I mean, the guy has a ton of political baggage. And another thing, he was so bad at this. because he absolutely ran his campaign into the ground because his staff was utter garbage. And there are tons of examples of this, but just to jog your memory on this, and partly because I just find it incredibly entertaining, remember that this was one of his advisors speaking to Jake Tapper on CNN on one of the big Sunday shows. Remember this?
Does he think that homosexual conduct should be illegal? It's a yes or no question.
Probably.
He probably thinks homosexual conduct should be illegal. And what would the punishment be for a man having sexual relations with another man or a woman having sexual relations with another woman? What should the punishment be?
It's just a sin, okay?
I understand what they tell you in church or what they tell you in synagogue or what they tell you in a mosque.
That's what my Bible tells me.
I'm not talking
the
about
Old Testament and the New Testament.
Well, I mean,
that's what this is about.
Judge Moore has also said that he doesn't think a Muslim member of Congress should be allowed to be in Congress. Why? Under what provision of the Constitution?
Because you have to swear on the Bible. When you are before, I had to do it. I'm an elected official 3 terms. I had to swear on a Bible. You have to swear on a Bible to be an elected official in the United States of America. He alleges that a Muslim cannot do that ethically, swearing on the Bible.
You don't actually have to swear on a Christian Bible. You can swear on anything, really. I don't know if you knew that. You can swear on a Jewish Bible.
Oh, no, I swore on the Bible. I've done it 3 times.
I'm sure you have. I'm sure you've picked a Bible, but the law is not that you have to swear on a Christian Bible. That is not the law. You don't know that? All right, Ted Crockett with
I don't know. I know that Donald Trump did it when we made him president.
Because he's Christian and he picked it. That's what he wanted to. That's what he wanted to swear in on. Ted Crockett with the Moore campaign.
I mean, just a dumpster fire of an interview. One of the worst interviews I've ever seen on TV, and that was part of the thing. And actually, it was one of the main reasons that towards the end I saw the wheels coming off of the Moore campaign, because even though I predicted that he was going to win, you may remember I said it's going to be narrow, but I think he's actually going to beat Doug Jones. I did not expect that it was going to come off the rails quite as much as it did. But I saw the wheels coming off of this thing early on, and it was because of stuff like that. I'm like, oh my gosh, if that is the best that the Moore campaign has, if this is the people running the Moore campaign, wow, that's not going to be easy to win. And sadly, that's what was going on. And it was Steve Bannon that kind of tipped me off to that. I was like, oh gosh, don't tell me he is actually considering bringing in Steve Bannon as an advisor on this. I mean, you could not have picked a worse person. Steve Bannon is one of the lowest human beings, I mean, in the country. There are very few political figures that I want to distance myself from more than Steve Bannon. Maybe Alex Jones in there somewhere. Somewhere with him, and he's basically one step away from a white supremacist, and I was like, please don't tell me that Roy Moore is actually considering letting this guy into the fold and making some decisions for him. And then, of course, he did. And once that happened, that was the last straw. I was like, nope, I can't do it. I don't know where Roy Moore is digging these people up from, but you can tell they have no freaking idea what they're doing. And that's one of the reasons that, and there's been absolutely no signs that this would change or would be different this time. It's one of the reasons that I just do not think that this guy has the political know-how to actually win this election. And another thing, and that last clip kind of highlighted it, one of the biggest hangups that I've always had with Roy Moore is that I have no problem being very public about my faith. I mean, that's the reason that I do this show. I have a Bible study at the end of every single episode that I do. I'm 100% in favor of people living out their faith, talking about it. I think we need more of that in the public sphere. But the problem that I have with Roy Moore is that he talks about us becoming a theocracy. And that is not a pro-freedom, pro-liberty stance. You heard it right there. And unfortunately, Roy Moore, Jake Tapper was reacting actually to a clip of Roy Moore talking, I think back in 2005, and saying that the act of homosexuality ought to be just outlawed completely, and his rationale was, well, it's against the Bible. Now, is it a sin? Absolutely. But that's within the church and God's jurisdiction, not the government's. Calling out sexual sin is their job, not the government's. And so it's a very anti-freedom way to look at it, and I do not like this idea of, well, whatever the Bible says, we're going to go ahead and make that's going to go ahead and be law, because you're trying to take a law of the spirit, a law of the heart, which the New Testament is, and make it into a physical law of a country. Now, that works with Judaism because that's what it was originally set up as. It was laws to govern the nation of Israel. But that's not what the Bible was set up to do. And Roy Moore keeps trying to sort of wirework it into where if the Bible says it's wrong, then it ought to be illegal. And that's a patchwork that just is a recipe for disaster, and it would actually cause a gigantic dearth of freedom, and in my opinion, would also, and I have quite a bit of evidence to back this up from the scripture, would actually be in contradiction to what the scripture teaches us to do. So there's just several reasons why Roy Moore is not the man for the job. He's not the man for the job right here, right now, and I don't think that he's a good candidate moving forward. There are several solid options on the table. Right now, Roy Moore is the one that is most likely to lose this seat, and for that reason alone, since you have other solid options, other conservatives, other people that already have a voting record, have legislative experience, you know that they're conservative, you know how they're going to vote, like Mooney, like Byrne, or like Moody, like Bradley Byrne, you've got those guys already out there. You know what they stand for. You know they're going to vote for conservative, and you know that they're not going to turn into a dumpster fire like the Moore campaign did that we just showed you one of the many examples of that happening on national TV. And so there's, at this point, really absolutely no logical reason to support the Moore campaign, in my opinion. I don't like saying that, but I think it's the truth. All right, we're going to take a break, and we'll be back in just a little bit.
Hey, where you going? Champ? Slugger? Hey, cowboy. Where you going? Where you going?
I'm going out!
Hey everybody, it's Caleb here, and I was just driving through South Alabama. I had a couple quick thoughts that I'd like to share with you. First of all, I really love it when the environmentalists tell us that there just are not enough trees, that we're killing all the trees, that there are no trees out there. As you can probably see through the window there, South Alabama is just trees. There's virtually nothing. You got maybe Andalusia, Enterprise, and Dothan, and trees, and that's pretty much it, other than Gulf Shores, which is the beach. So I genuinely believe that it should be part of our criminal justice system that any liberal that whines too much about there not being enough trees, that their sentence, their punishment for that, should be to drive through South Alabama, because they will be immediately disillusioned about this idea that there are just not enough trees left in the world. There is nothing but trees for miles and miles and miles and miles. Another thing that I wanted to bring up, and it actually made me hearken back to a comment that was made, I would say a few months ago, by Hillary Clinton, talking about how the coast, in other words, the people in California and Oregon and Washington and then New England, that they all voted for her and everybody else voted for Trump, which, you know, is true. And then she also talks about trying to essentially explain why that is. She says that, well, all the dynamic people, all the movers and shakers and the people that are making money, those are the ones that voted for me. It was the neophytes, the little people over in flyover country that voted for Trump. And goodness knows that I'm not the world's biggest Trump supporter. I didn't even vote for the guy in the first election. But one of the reasons that she lost that election in the first place, and one of the reasons that Americans in general are just so tired of that, is because there is a large contingency of the left that genuinely believes that only people in the cities are the ones that are dynamic and important. And I'm driving through South Alabama, and right now it's mostly just trees, but especially when you get a little bit further north. I was driving through here and I noticed there's so many fields with cattle and hay, and you get a little bit further south and you're going to see an awful lot of cotton and peanuts and some soybeans. And so I really do think, and I think that this is important to remember, that though there are people in the cities that tend to vote Democrat and have never seen a farm, have never been through, quote unquote, the flyover country, I think it's incredibly important for us to remember that, yeah, they may look their nose down at people like that, but if you were to actually take one of those people and have them try to survive in an environment where there were not the people producing their food and their fiber in states like Alabama, that those cities would immediately devolve into chaos and die. And I think it's so hilarious that the people in cities look down their nose at people in the country, people in farmland, that kind of thing, and then they wouldn't even be able to begin to have a similar lifestyle that they do if it were not for those people. And maybe I'm thinking about this because I'm an ag major and state convention for the Alabama FFA is coming up. But what it really all boils down to is that whether they appreciate it or not, whether or not they understand the relationship between their life and what they're doing and people in places like this that provide the lumber for the house that they live in or the building that they work in, and provide the cotton for their clothes and provide the food that goes on their table, they would quickly learn an appreciation once that stuff went away. Once they realized that the magic bread fairy doesn't just bring bread to the supermarket, that there are people involved in the growth and production and transportation of that, I think it would really paint it in a different light. And what I mean by that is, I don't think that it's productive for us to go out and talk about how silly and stupid they are and how ridiculous their position is on that, even though there's some truth to it. I think we do better catching more flies with honey than vinegar and explain to them and talk to them and educate them about the important role of middle America to the rest of the world, to the rest of the economy, because the reason that we are an economic powerhouse, the reason that we have so many people that don't have to be involved directly in growing their own food and wondering where their food's going to come from one day to the next, the best way to do that is through education and helping them to understand that that is an important part of it. So let's just try to come at it from a diplomatic perspective, and hopefully they'll be able to realize at that point that it's important for them to appreciate the American farmer.
All right, and we're back, so we'll go ahead and go straight to the daily dose of stupid.
That was stupid.
I know it was stupid.
Really stupid.
Hey, I just said it was stupid.
And today's daily dose of stupid comes to us via Elizabeth Warren. So Elizabeth Warren, senator from Massachusetts, going to be running for the presidency, of course. Now she wants reparation for gays. So we've heard a lot about reparations for slavery, which is absurd in and of itself, and that's a whole other conversation that we'll have some other time. But now what she wants is reparations for gay couples. So the other day she introduced a bill called the Refund Equality Act, which would allow gays to retroactively amend their past tax returns to allow for tax breaks. So essentially they would say, okay, we've actually been married for years, we've just only been able to file jointly as a couple on our taxes since now, so what this act would do was allow them to go back, I don't know if there's even a limit, I guess as far back as they want to, and say, okay, we were really married back then, so now you have to retroactively recognize our marriage back then before the Obergefell decision came down and give us the tax benefits of being a married couple from all the way back then. So it looks like, based on a joint committee, the Joint Committee on Taxation did a little study on this and tried to see how much it was going to be. It will cost about $57 million in refunds. So essentially, the way it would work is they would be getting a refund from the IRS for taxes that they paid, which were supposedly illegitimate because they were actually a married couple. So there's a whole jumble of different things on this. Warren actually did an interview with NBC News and said this: the federal government forced legally married same-sex couples in Massachusetts, because remember, it was legal then for a long time, same-sex couples in Massachusetts to file as individuals and pay more in taxes for almost a decade. We need to call out that discrimination and to make it right. Now, first of all, this is shamelessly pandering, and unfortunately we've seen a lot of this from the Democrat side for a while now. They basically have opted to just buy votes from people. They're all coming out and saying, okay, if you vote for me, then my policy is going to be I'm going to take money from people over there and give it to you, which is the reason that you should vote for me. And they're usually lying about where they're going to get the money, because they say, well, we're going to be taxing the 1%, or we're going to be taxing just the uber rich, or as Bernie Sanders would say, the 1%, the wealthiest. So they're saying that we're going to tax just those people. We're going to take it from those evil, evil, greedy rich people and then give it to you. And that's going to fix everything. And that's the reason you should vote for me. They really are just buying votes at this point. Now, granted, the Democrats have been doing this for about 100 years now. But now they're really not even masking it very well. They're basically just blatantly saying, we'll take money from this group of people and give it to you. And that's the reason that you should vote for us. That's the reason black people should vote for us, because we're going to give you reparations for slavery. Now, there's an awful lot of black people in this country that their ancestors didn't even go through that, and there's an awful lot of white people that were never slave owners, and so on and so forth. So there's a myriad of reasons why that doesn't work. But now they're doing the same thing with the gay community. I think what's happening here, because everything has a strategy to it, I think what Elizabeth Warren is trying to do is she's trying to take votes away from Buttigieg. Because, of course, the only intersectionality label that Buttigieg has is that he's a gay guy. And the only one that Elizabeth Warren has is that she's a lady. And being very fast and loose with that term, but she's a woman. And now that she's lost the Native American thing, Pocahontas has to fall back on the only thing that she actually does have, the only intersectionality label that she does have, which is that she's female. And so to try to sponge some of the gay votes, or the people that are sympathetic to the gay vote, away from Buttigieg, she figures that this is a pretty good way to handle it. That's the way that I see it. But I will say this. I'm actually going to defend this, at least in part. Not to say that the reparations is a good idea, but the principle underlying it, I think, is not all that terrible. So take the politics out of it. Take away the fact that Elizabeth Warren is shamelessly pandering to voters and trying to buy their votes. Take away the fact that she's probably specifically trying to hit Buttigieg to sort of bolster her own poll numbers. Take all that out of it. And take out the moral discrepancy of homosexuality and the Obergefell case and all of that. Let's just look at the tax code. Because I think there actually is a good point that Elizabeth Warren is making if you look past all the crazy stuff. If you dig right past that 50 feet of stupid that this thing is covered in, you actually do get to a pretty good underlying principle. And so, as dumb as this does make more sense than the slave reparations, because at least this is dealing with people that are still alive and that actually did have this happen to them in their lifetime. Now, whether or not you think that was just or unjust is a different matter entirely, but the point is, at the very least, it does have that going for it. That these are things that happen to these people, not people that lived 150 years ago, people that are still alive today that did not get those tax breaks that they legally did under Massachusetts law, that kind of thing. And Elizabeth Warren was saying this is discrimination, which technically it is. Now, I don't think it's the kind of discrimination that she's talking about, but technically speaking, this is discrimination. I want you to think about this. The idea that the government is saying, you know what, you don't have to pay us quite as much in taxes if you're married makes absolutely no sense. It makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. For one, because people that are married tend to do economically better anyway. If you're looking at it statistically, and there's an argument to be made here of whether it's a cause and effect fallacy, is it that people that are more financially stable tend to get married? I think there's some truth to that because a lot of people tend to want to be in a place where they have financial means to be able to provide for a spouse. And they don't want to bring kids into the world unless they do know where their next meal is coming from, which, is a good idea, actually. So there is something positive to be said for people that are getting married. And I've always said that is the number one economic determining factor, whether or not you're economically stable or not. Whether your parents were married, if you're a kid, and if you're an adult, whether or not you were married. And so there really is something beneficial about that. So why are they giving tax breaks to people that are married when they're the ones that are more likely to be making more money? That doesn't really make any sense. And secondly, why are you getting a tax break for being married in the first place? Like, even if that economic fact weren't true, why does the government just say to you, yeah, you're married, so we're not going to take as much in taxes? Where did they even come up with that? You see, the problem is the tax code itself is discriminatory. It does discriminate against gay people, but it also equally discriminates against people that are not married. People like me that I'm 30 years old now, just had a birthday, which means for 12 years now, I've been paying taxes at a rate, despite the fact that there are discounts for being married, which are not available to me. I don't have access to that discount. Married people are paying less than me, which is by definition discriminatory. So the question then isn't, why is the government discriminating against gay people? It's, why is the government why are they trying to give incentives for something like that at all? Why are they in the business of trying to figure out whether or not somebody is married or not? And why is it that a single person like myself doesn't have access to the same tax benefits as non-married people? So if you're digging, like I said, you have to go through 50 feet of stupid that Elizabeth Warren has piled on top of this. But if you get down all the way to the principle underlying this, she's actually correct. The tax code is inherently discriminatory, and that we need to do something to resolve that. We need to do something to ensure that when we're looking at this, when we're looking at somebody and how much they should pay in taxes, that we're not saying, nope, you're single, you have to pay more. So inadvertently, what is actually being done here is that Elizabeth Warren is unknowingly making an excellent case for the flat tax. Because then there's no discounts, 10% across the board, 15%, whatever percentage you want, we can haggle on that if you want. I think Rand Paul said 15.5. I've heard people say 15 or 17. I say 10, but I'm a little bit more flexible on that. But the point is, if there's a flat tax rate and everybody's paying less and nobody gets a discount, then it's fair. We have a principle in this country called equality under the law. And whenever it comes to taxes, for whatever reason, we decide, yeah, well, to heck with that, we're throwing that out. I don't know why. I don't understand why that's the one area of law that we say, no, we're going to need some people to pay more than others. I guess it's because it's politically feasible or popular. And one thing that it does is it makes our system incredibly convoluted. It has the IRS seizing and holding on to your money for a large portion of the year, interest-free, by the way, and then gives it back to you when your refund comes in and pretends like they've done some great favor to you by giving you back your own money that they held against your will without interest. Now, if we want to fix the tax code in this country, pay it in one lump sum, pay it monthly, have them take it out of your paycheck like they do now. But the discounts, the give-backs, holding on to your return, that needs to stop. The tax code is incredibly convoluted, It should be one flat rate against the board. Everybody pays the same. Now, obviously, some people make more, so you're going to be paying more because a percentage of some incomes is higher than others. But the point is, at the end of the day, when everything's said and done, nobody's getting extra breaks or special treatments. There are no tax loopholes because there's no such, you can't have a loophole in a flat tax if everybody's getting charged the same. And so if you dig way past all the stuff that Elizabeth Warren is saying and get to the principle underlying what she's saying, that is actually sound. And that's something that we should pursue. Let's go to the chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Chaplain's report today does come from the book of Daniel. We're continuing our series on that. And by the way, speaking of biblical things, I will be preaching at the Midway Church of Christ up in near Decatur, Alabama. It's actually in Trinity, Alabama. And that will be happening Wednesday, so look for some updates with that. But we're going to go ahead and get into the book of Daniel today in chapter 9. And this is in the middle of one of Daniel's prayers to God about the plight of Israel. And remember that at the time of Daniel, Israel is in captivity. The reason that Daniel is where he is while he's writing the book of Daniel is because he is one of the people that was taken away to Babylon. And even though this prayer presumably is after the fall of Babylon, where the Medes and the Persians have taken over, Israel has still not returned home. Israel is still being held against their will and is still not the master of their own dominion. They still do not have free reign, and they are not a free people at this point. And Daniel gives a prayer partly in lamentation over the plight of Israel, and that comes from Daniel 9, 7 through 8. Righteousness belongs to you, O Lord, but to us open shame, as it is this day to the men of Judah, the inhabitants of Jerusalem and all Israel, those who are nearby and those who are far away in all the countries to which you have driven them, because of their unfaithful deeds which they have committed against you. Open shame belongs to us, O Lord, to our kings, our princes, and our fathers, because we have sinned against you. Now, in this particular passage, you can see Daniel's understanding, and we talked about this the last time we discussed this in a chaplain's report. Daniel has an amazing amount of perspective on this. He understands that the reason that Israel is in the shape that it is not because God came down and punished them for no reason. It's that he allowed them to essentially become the victims of their own circumstances. He allowed them to become the victims of their own iniquity. It wasn't so much that God made this happen. It was more like Israel abandoned God, and because of that, God lifted his hand of protection away from them. After he repeatedly told them not to, after he repeatedly gave them chances to repent and change their ways, Israel still refused to do the right thing. And Daniel understands that. Daniel understands that this isn't what God wanted. And if God had his way about it, he would have rather they repented and been able to continue to protect them. But they didn't do that. And in this verse specifically, one of the things that I wanted to point to is he draws this contrast between God and Israel. He's saying, righteousness belongs to you. We have open shame. And then he describes the reasons for that. Why is it that God has righteousness and Israel is to be shamed? Because God kept his end of the bargain, Israel didn't. You see, in God's case, he made a covenant with Israel long ago, all the way back in the time of Moses, long before Daniel was even thought of. And he made this covenant with Israel. He says, I will be your God if you will be my people, if you will keep my precepts, if you will do what I tell you, if you will obey the law, then you're going to have a special relationship with me that no other country has. And because of that, you'll have certain privileges and protections. And if you'll just do that, if you'll just live by this covenant, then I'm going to be there protecting you. And Israel agreed. But they didn't hold up their end of the bargain. So many times in the history of Israel, they fell away, they got involved in idol worship and all kinds of other horrible things. Sometimes even things as gruesome and evil as fornication and child sacrifice. I mean, just devastating spiritual things. Horrible sins. And despite this, they usually wound up straightening up, and then God came back and forgave them, and then the cycle repeated itself all over again. You see, here Daniel, he is drawing this contrast, partly because it's true, but also, and I think this is the reason that this prayer is recorded and written down, is so that he could help instruct Israel. And there's something for us to take away from this as well. He's telling Israel, if you're going to point the finger of blame, point it at yourself. You're the one that didn't uphold your end of the bargain. And you'll notice that it is the deeds of God, what God has done, that has earned him righteousness. He's one worthy of praise and worship. And contrast that with what we have. We have open shame. And the reason we have open shame is because we separated ourselves from God. So you see, what's happening is, the reason Daniel is drawing this distinction is because he's saying, the reason that we are in the state that we're in is because we decided that we're going to be unlike God. Because if there's one thing that's true throughout the Bible, and the Bible emphasizes this, that to be good is to be God-like. And when Israel and its people stopped reflecting the values of God, when they stopped trying to be like God and live up to his ideals and to follow the righteousness that he offered, well, then they stopped being the beneficiaries of his blessings as well. And so it's not that God moved or that God didn't keep his word. It's that Israel started pulling away from him little by little, and eventually they got to the point to where God wouldn't protect them anymore. And then open shame became theirs. All they would have to do to have the same kind of glory and honor and prestige amongst other nations that they once had under kings like David is to obey God and do what he told them to be like God, to follow after that righteousness, and then that gap gets a lot closer and God starts protecting them again. You see, Israel's the one that left God. God is not the one that abandoned Israel. And Daniel understands that and is making that very clear, and he says, the shame belongs to us, O Lord, our kings, our princes, and our fathers. You see the line of the chain of command here that Daniel is talking about? He's saying our kings, they disobeyed you. And because of that, they were put to open shame. And when the king disobeyed you, our princes also disobeyed you, the people that were directly under the king. And then our fathers disobeyed you. The people that were supposed to run the families of Israel, the people that were supposed to keep their own families in line and teach them about the Torah and teach them about the laws of Moses and make sure that their family, even if everybody else around them was doing wrong, that they were acting right. Our fathers failed you. And the reason that this scares me is because I think America is in a pretty similar boat. Now, I get that we're not the chosen people of God, and God doesn't have that special relationship with America like he does Israel. But I do think that we're going to be judged in a similar way. You see, our politicians, they've done some bad things. They've left trying to be righteous and trying to be moral like God. And then some of our other elected officials, more at the local level, started doing the same thing. But what really put the last nail in the coffin, what really has moved us further away from God is that our fathers are not doing their job, just like they did in Israel. Even if the kings and the princes were all corrupt, as long as the family unit was intact, as long as the fathers did what was right, they would at least have been saved from open shame. But Daniel is saying all of those fail-safes moved away from God and refused to do what he wanted to, and because of that, everybody, the entire nation was lost and were put to open shame. And if we're not careful, this country is going to suffer a very similar fate. Daniel knew it, and it's still true today. And so if we want to strengthen our nation and we want to turn our nation back towards God, we can't always control what the politicians do. We can't always control what our leaders and the influential people in our country can do. We can control what happens in our own household. We can control what fathers and brothers, we can control what our families do. And that's the most important role that we have, to make sure that we're the ones following God. Stay the course, friends.
Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Any opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media. The theme song for Tactics is 6 Foot Town by Big and Rich. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Broadcast studios provided by Cumulus Media Montgomery. Location studios provided by the Dalraida Church of Christ. Copyright 2019.